In this video, you will learn everything you need to know for picking up Oracle Discipline Priest in M+. We will cover your core healing abilities, your main cooldowns, the correct usage of your Premonitions, as well as your healing rotation. We will then conclude with some final remarks about talents, stats, and trinkets. I strongly recommend watching the video from beginning to end, as we are diving deep into the critical interactions between your abilities and talents during all parts of the video to help you understand the class at a foundational level. However, if you're looking for something very specific, feel free to use the video chapters instead. Let's begin by talking about your main rotational abilities and talents. At the core of Priest gameplay lies Atonement. When Atonement is applied to a player, all spell damage you deal will heal the player by a percentage of the damage done. As a result, much of the healing you do is actually done by dealing damage. A central point of focus is therefore to keep Atonement applied to all of your teammates all of the time. Atonement can be reapplied by any of your healing spells except for Penance or via Power Word Radiance. Radiance is your main healing ramp, and it is one of the most important buttons in your arsenal. A good rule of thumb is to just apply Power Word Radiance to your group each time that Atonement has run out. However, because the cooldown of Radiance is slightly longer than the Atonement duration, this approach leaves small gaps in Atonement uptime on your party. Consequently, you sometimes want to apply Atonement to your group manually without pressing Radiance. One way to do this is by using Renew. Renew is a pretty useless spell overall, as it barely heals anything, and you never want to use Renew as part of your main rotation. However, when you have some time before a pull starts, you can use Renew to apply Atonement to your teammates. By doing that, you can delay your first use of Radiance and thereby make sure that it is available for use during the fight. If your Atonements ever run out during the fight, use your other healing abilities to individually apply it to your party members again, so long as you don't have any Radiance available. Especially Flash Heal is useful here, as you spec into Binding Heals, which makes Flash Heal hit your target as well as yourself, thereby applying Atonement to both of you. Thus, if you ever use Flash Heal to apply Atonement, never target yourself, always target a teammate. Of course, you can also use your other healing abilities to keep Atonement applied to your party. Okay, so we've got that covered. Always keep Atonement on your team. Let's now move on to your two main healing abilities. First, you have Penance. It is a channel spell that fires out 4 bolts of Holy Light at your target. You can choose to use Penance defensively by casting it on a teammate, which heals them as well as other party members with Atonements active. Alternatively, you can use Penance offensively, casting it at an enemy, damaging them, and healing your party only through Atonement. When you play Encroaching Shadows, offensive Penance bolts on a target affected by your Shadow Word Pain will spread the Shadow Word Pain to 2 nearby targets. This is an important part of your rotation, and you want to use offensive penances to spread Shadow Word Pain frequently. Remember that the damage from Shadow Word Pain also contributes to your Atonement healing, and the ticks of Shadow Word Pain trigger Power of the Dark Side, which makes spreading it quite important. Moreover, due to the Twin Side talent, a defensive penance will always include 3 offensive penance bolts, and an offensive penance will always include 3 defensive ones. Thus, each penance fires a total of 7 bolts. Because of the Wheel and Woe talent, each penance you cast will therefore either empower your next Powered Shield by 35% or your next Smite by 140%. This is the most important talent interaction around which Oracle Priest gameplay revolves, and we will discuss it more deeply at a later point in the video. Your second main healing spell is Power Word Shield. Due to preventive measures, shields are very powerful for Oracle Priests. Make it a habit to press Power Word Shield on cooldown. Apart from the strong damage absorption it affords, using the ability on cooldown gives you an 8% haste buff for 4 seconds via borrowed time. As Power Word Shield itself is only on a 6-second cooldown, using it on cooldown will buff you with 8% haste most of the time. Another noteworthy talent interactions of Power Word Shield is Prophet's Will, which increases the effectiveness of shields on yourself by 30%. To maximize HPS, you should therefore prioritize using shields on yourself rather than on your teammates. The juggling of Penance and Power Word Shield makes up for most of your healing. However, due to their cooldowns, there will be some downtime between those abilities which other spells need to bridge. And your main filler ability is Smite. Whenever you have nothing else to press, spam Smite at an enemy. It will provide a small heal to all targets affected by Atonement. Also, the Divine Procession talent causes Smite casts to extend the duration of the lowest duration active Atonement by 3 seconds, which can help a lot with maintaining Atonement uptime. However, what you will find frequently is that simply spamming Smite is not enough to keep your team alive during the gaps between Penance and Shields. This is where Flash Heal comes into play. Cast Flash Heal on an ally whenever you need spot healing that Smite cannot cover. Also, as mentioned before, it can be useful to reapply Atonement. Most of the time you will be able to cast Flash Heal instantly due to Surge of Light procs, but hard casting it is also okay. Finally, you have your shadow spells in Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death. Using Mind Blast empowers your next penance via Dark Indulgence. Theoretically, you can use this as a minor healing cooldowns, but I would suggest just applying the blanket solution of casting Mind Blast on cooldown for maximum DPS and HPS. Shadow Word Death deals quite a lot of damage and therefore also a good amount of atonement healing. Try using it on cooldown and preferably target enemies with less than 20% HP, as it will deal additional damage to these targets and be usable twice in a row due to Death and Madness. Alright, these were your main rotational abilities. Your main healing cooldowns are your 4 Premonitions from the Oracle hero talents. However, due to their high importance, we will discuss them later in a separate section of the video. The first of your other healing cooldowns is Evangelism, which is a pretty big heal on all players who have Atonement applied to them, and it also refreshes the duration of Atonement by 6 seconds. Evangelism is only on a 1.5 minute cooldown, and I would suggest being quite trigger happy with its usage. In contrast, Ultimate Penitence is on a much longer 4-minute cooldown. It will make your character ascend into the air, give yourself a huge shield, but also slow down your movement speed, while channeling bolts of holy light at either teammates or at enemies. As with Penance, you therefore need to decide between offensive and defensive usage of Ultimate Penitence. I would suggest using it mainly defensively, targeting a teammate to apply a high amount of heal while channeling. However, Ultimate Penitence is not great for burst healing, as it takes quite some time for its healing to be delivered. Its correct usage takes some getting used to. When you do cast it offensively by targeting an enemy, make sure that Atonement is applied to your group for the entire duration of the channel, otherwise it will not heal your teammates. As a third healing cooldown, you have Shadow Fiend or Mindbender if you choose the Mindbender talent. Casting it will transform your Penance cast into Dark Reprimand due to the Shadow Covenant talent, amplifying its damage and healing. Finally, you have 2 charges of Pain Suppression, reducing the damage on the targeted player by 50% for 8 seconds. Pain Suppression does not trigger a global cooldown and can therefore be used very dynamically during the fight. Mostly, you want to use it on the tank. Personally, when playing with pugs, I like to apply Pain Sub to the tank at the start of big pulls, because many tanks sort of struggle with proper usage of defensive cooldowns while aggroing and gathering up big trash packs. Finally, you have Power Word Barrier, which puts a dome of holy light on the ground, reducing damage done to all players who stand in it by 20%. In terms of additional defensive cooldowns for yourself, you have Fade, reducing your damage taken by 10% via Translucent Image. You may also want to talent into Improve Fade to reduce its cooldown further. Note that Fade also reduces your effective aggro range, so you can use it to bypass enemies at a distance that other specs can't, for example when skipping the pack in front of the Candle King in the Dark Flame Cleft. Moreover, when you cast Flash Heal, you will also apply an additional 10% damage reduction to yourself via Protective Light. Thus, you can apply a 20% damage reduction to yourself at a very low cooldown. But that's also all that you have in terms of damage reduction, making you rather squishy compared with some other healers. You may want to augment your usage of Fade and Flash Heal by applying shields to yourself before a big damage event happens, just to make sure that you will be able to live through it. Finally, if these things are not enough, you have Desperate Prayer, which increases your maximum HP and heals you for the same amount. In terms of utility, Priest is a bit of a mixed bag. I have seen some guides extolling priests for not having an interrupt, saying something like, what's great is that you don't have to worry about interrupts because you don't have one. Yeah, okay, you don't need to worry about it, but still not having an interrupt is a major disadvantage of the specialization. All you can do is essentially use Psychic Scream as a sort of a melee AoE interrupt. However, you do bring some utility to partially make up for these deficiencies. First up is Power Infusion, enhancing the haste of a target by 20%. Because you talent into Twins of the Sun Priestess, you never want to use Power Infusion on yourself. Always use it on a teammate. Moreover, I would strongly suggest picking up a weak aura such as Ellesmere's Power Infusion Helper to tell you when and to whom you should apply your Power Infusion. As a second powerful utility spell, you have Master Spell, removing one beneficial magic effect from enemies and all harmful effects from allies in a large radius. It is situationally very useful, for example when fighting the dogs before the second boss in Workshop, or to dispel the restorative algae heals from the disturbed kelps in front of Swampface. Finally, you provide some softer form of utility in Mind Soothe, which reduces the aggro range of mobs and allows for certain skips that are otherwise not possible. You also have access to Mind Control, which can sometimes be useful. For example, you can Mind Control one of the Yes Men before the end boss in Cinderbrew Meadery, preventing them from being healed up when the first enemy dies. You can then release him and kill him at a low HP. Finally, you have Leap of Faith to yoink a friendly player toward you. And while this is not often useful, it can, for example, grip the tank out of an electrified puddle on the last boss in Floodgate, preventing them from dying. And tanks seem to have a bit of a thing for getting knocked into those. Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff. Let's talk Premonitions. There are a total of 4 different Premonitions, which are your main healing cooldowns as Oracle Priest, and their usage strongly determines the quality of your gameplay. You can have up to 2 charges of Premonitions. This means that if you have 2 charges available, you can cycle from one Premonition directly into the next without incurring a cooldown. The order in which Premonitions become available to you is always the same. At the start of the dungeon, the Premonition which is available is Premonition of Insight, and it is your second most powerful Premonition. When used, it reduces the cooldown of your next 3 spells by 7 seconds. Note that this only applies to spells which have a cooldown, so casting, for example, Smite or Flash Heal will not consume a charge of the Insight cooldown reduction. Note also that the cooldown of Penance and Power Word Shield is lower than 7 seconds, meaning that Premonition of Insight will cause these abilities to not have any cooldown whatsoever. Now, there are multiple ways for you to leverage the cooldown reduction provided by Premonition of Insight. For maximum burst healing, you want to use Premonition of Insight followed by 4 successive Penance casts on your teammates. So, cast Premonition into Penance, 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 Penance. This use case can be good, for example, on the spider tanks in Workshop, where you will need as much healing as possible over a short duration. However, the 4 times Penance spell sequencing also has the disadvantage of being inefficient. This is because each Penance will grant you 7 stacks of Wheel and Woe, which you may want to consume for empowering Smite or Power Word Shield. However, if you immediately cast another Penance, you waste these stacks of Wheel and Woe, as it does not stack beyond 8. Thus, a more efficient way of using Premonition of Insight is to cast Smite after each Penance cast. So, Penance, Smite, Penance, Smite, Penance, Smite, Penance. This allows you to obtain maximum value from the Wheel and Woe stacks while still allowing you to cast 3 off cooldown penances. Generally speaking, this should be your go-to usage when healing group-wide damage. Use the sequencing without Smite only when the damage is extremely high or when you need to move around a lot and can't stand still for casting Smite, for example when fighting the Azerite extractors in the Motherlode. Finally, you may need to use Premonition of Insight in a scenario where more focused damage is coming in rather than some group-wide AoE damage. For example, on the first boss in Cinderbrew Meadery. Here, you may want to sequence your spells by casting Penance, Shield, Penance, Shield, Penance. This allows you to put out 2 fully empowered shields on individual players while also obtaining the value of 3 penances. Finally, you can also be a bit more creative with Premonition of Insight, using it for example to cast multiple dispels in a row. However, this is a rather rare use case, especially since you also have access to Mass Dispel for these situations. I also want to address a common rotational mistake with this premonition. Casting any premonition will cause your next power word Radiance to be an instant cast, so you might naturally want to go Insight into Radiance into Penance. However, using Radiance after casting the premonition will consume one of the cooldown reduction stacks which it provides, which is not something that you want. Thus, cast Radiance first, then activate your premonition, then go into the sequences we have talked about. A second premonition is Premonition of Piety, which is the third most powerful premonition. You can treat it essentially as a flat healing cooldown as it enhances your healing for 15 seconds. Note that with this premonition, it is absolutely okay to use it for an instant cast Power Word Radiance, as there are no cooldown reduction stacks to be consumed. In fact, it is superior to use Radiance after Piety, as it then benefits from the healing buff, which Premonition of Piety provides. Third, you have your arguably weakest premonition, which is Premonition of Solace. It applies 1 large shield as well as affording the instant cast Power Word Radiance. Usually I like to apply the shield from Solace via Renew and then shield another target with Power Word Shield. It can be quite useful in spot healing situations because in addition to the shield it applies a 15% damage reduction for 15 seconds. This also makes it very useful for tank healing on big pulls, as it serves as a pretty big external damage reduction outside of pain suppression. Finally, after you have used your 3 premonitions, they cycle into Premonition of Clairvoyance, which combines all of the effects from Insight, Piety and Solace into one big premonition. This is your single biggest healing cooldown and it is extremely powerful. What I like to do is use Clairvoyance, then apply the shield from Premonition of Solace by casting Renew and then cycling into the sequences for Premonition of Insight, which we have discussed earlier. Alright, we have now considered all important abilities and cooldowns. Let's now look at your healing rotation in a bit more detail. By the way, if you find this video helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel. It helps me out a lot and makes sure that you won't miss any future guides like this. As for the rotation, the core mantra you should follow when playing Oracle Discipline Priest is to use Penance and Power Word Shield on cooldown. Especially using Power Word Shield on cooldown is vital for maintaining the 8% haste buff from borrowed time. Do not forget to prioritize yourself when applying shields, as shields on yourself are 30% more effective due to Prophet's Will. Conversely, using Penance on cooldown is important because it procs Wheel and Woe. Most often, you want to use your Wheel and Woe stacks to empower a shield rather than empower Smite. A common rotational problem that arises from this is that you cast Penance but your shield is still on cooldown, which sort of pushes you into consuming Wheel and Woe stacks with Smite. This is a rotational mistake that you should try to minimize by planning out your spell sequencing in such a way that shield is available when Penance finishes. If it is not, you may use Flash Heal, Mind Blast or Shadow Word Death instead of Smite so that your stacks are not consumed. However, these things notwithstanding, using Wheel and Woe for Smite is not inherently bad, and it's not a major problem if it happens. In fact, for dealing damage, it is the superior choice. Now I also want to briefly address the spell sequencing when starting a big pull. What I like to do is apply Atonement to my team with Renew before the pull starts. Then cast Shadow Word Pain on an enemy and spread it with Penance while the tank is still gathering up the mobs. Afterwards, you want to prepare your big heals by setting up your Premonition of Insight. Do that by casting Shadow Fiend first, then Mind Blast, then Shadow Word Death, Smite, or perhaps Radiance, based on whether your atonements are already running out. And afterwards, activate your Premonition of Insight and cast the spell sequences we have discussed. If you mistime the usage of Insight and group-wide damage is not yet going out on the group, but you have already activated your Premonition of Insight, you can just spam Smite until the damage hits and then move into the Insight sequence later. While doing that, Divine Procession will help you keep Atonement on your team while you wait for the damage to come in. A main weakness of Oracle Priest is that it can feel a bit like a sitting duck if you have no cooldowns available. That's also why consistent healing checks like the Candle King or the Paladins can feel challenging for this specialization. Thus, the spec depends quite strongly on mapping the use of your cooldowns against the dungeon you are in. Know that your power peaks when Premonition of Clairvoyance is available, not only because it is the most powerful healing cooldown, but also because it cycles into Premonition of Insight, which is also extremely powerful. It is therefore very important to align this power spike with the healing requirements of the dungeon. Make sure, for example, to have Clairvoyance available for the spider tanks in Workshop or when pulling the Candle King. Generally, have Clairvoyance available for all major healing checks in the dungeon. Finally, a word on your damage rotation. First, apply Shadow Word Pain, spread it with Penance, and continue spreading it with Penance throughout the fight. Otherwise, spam Smite and use Shadow Word Death and Mind Blast on cooldown. Now, discussing the rotation of the specialization in sort of this static way by talking about the different abilities which we are using can be helpful, but I think it's also helpful to consider it in sort of a real-life scenario and commenting on why which ability is used at each point. And that's what we're going to do now, looking at a real healing example from a dungeon which I've recently played, and I will be commenting on the rotation. Okay, so let's look at a healing example to sort of illustrate how the rotation of Oracle Priest plays out in practice. We are about to pull the end boss in Operation Floodgate on level 16. Here you can see that my cooldown situation is not the best. I don't have my Premonition of Clairvoyance available because I used it on the jump starters beforehand. I do have Evangelism though, and I do also have my Powered Barrier. So we should be okay. Note that this boss immediately goes into a big AoE when he is being pulled. And I have applied with Renew, I have applied Atonements to the group, so I don't need to blow through my first Radiance at the very beginning, so I had the time to apply Atonement. I put down my Powered Barrier here to reduce the damage of the turbocharge which is coming up. Now let's see what I do. Okay, so I use my Shadow Fiend to amplify the power of my penance as Dark Reprimand. And I also use my Premonition of Piety to just generally increase the amount of healing that I can do. I probably now go into an instant cast Radiance here, and you see we are pretty safe at this point. Now I go into Dark Reprimand, into Shield, and now I could start spamming Smite, but the damage is so high that Smite really doesn't do enough to be able to heal it. So I pick out individual targets and I cast Flash Heal on them, because this will be more potent in terms of keeping my team alive. So I use Flash Heals, and then Dark Reprimand comes off cooldown as well as Shield, so I use those. Our priest gets hit here by the things that come from the roof, so nothing we could do about this there. Now we have the Giga Zaps going out, which deal a lot of damage. And let's see how we handle it. So we put Shield on one player. Usually I like to put Shield on one player and then use Penance on the other. Cast a Radiance, okay, yeah, maybe. So I cast it on him because he was just revived. Wasn't necessary because I would have healed him up anyway. Could have also used it on the Evoker, but he also had a death cooldown active, so both variants are probably fine. Now comes the Leaping Sparks phase. We just maintain Atonement uptime, and I do this here with casting Renew. There's nothing else to do really, so I just put out a couple of Renews to renew literally the Atonements on our team. Now comes the next set of Giga Zaps, which does a lot of damage. So I cast Penance on one target, Shield the other, and now I cast Flash Heal on him, keeping in mind that with Binding Heals, this also heals me and also reapplies Atonement to both of us. So it's good to shield yourself, because shield will be a higher value on yourself, and then you can also profit from the Binding Heals with Flash Heal healing both of you, rather than when you do it the other way around. So now I should reapply Radiance. Yeah, there's Radiance. I use my Premonition of Solace, give a big shield to myself, and also to just get the Premonition of Clairvoyance back up for this turbocharge. So another Flash Heal, Penance. Would actually, here there's the Clairvoyance, into Penance, into Smite, into Penance, into Smite, into Penance, into Shield. I would have liked to see myself cast a shield because it was ready before I started the Premonition of Clairvoyance, but here was actually a good example where this was pretty close in terms of healing, even though I did cast the Penance, Smite, Penance, Smite, Penance, Smite. So this is actually an example where the Penance, 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 Penance rotation is a bit superior maybe, or maybe I could have done Penance, Smite, Penance, Smite, Penance, Penance, because then it wouldn't have gotten so close, because Penance really doesn't heal that much. Smite really doesn't heal that much, but Penance does. Anyway, we get through it, and now we are back into reapplying atonements with Flash Heal, and also the shield of course reapplies atonement. See, my add-on told me to PI the mage, so that's also a bit helpful when you just get the mental constraint out of your head when to apply your power infusion, because the add-on will do it for you. We still have, that's probably a bit of a mistake, we still have our Evangelism available. I would have liked to see myself use it much more freely, because it's on a low cooldown, and it really isn't the one that you should be holding the entire time, but you should be using it quite frequently. So that's a bit of a mistake, but I hope you could see a little bit how the rotation is playing out here. Now, I also want to briefly discuss talents. However, as most people just copy talents from one of the top players anyway, this section is abbreviated, only discussing the most important trade-offs in your talent tree. You can find my talent import string in the video description. On the side of the spec tree, these are the talents I run. As a first point of contention, you can choose to run Shadow Fiend and Lenience, versus dropping Lenience in favor of Mindbender. Generally speaking, Lenience is the better choice, especially in high keys, but Mindbender feels better to play. Second, you can select if you want to take the path into Wheel and Woe via Blaze of Light or via Harsh Discipline. I personally run Harsh Discipline, but both options are viable. Third, I have seen a few players give up the ability to spread Shadow Word Pain via Encroaching Shadows for Abyssal Reverie, which enhances atonement healing from shadow spells. However, I think this is the inferior option and should only be used when you struggle to consistently spread Shadow Word Pain. Finally, depending on whether you feel that you are running out of mana, you can swap between talenting Shield Discipline, which is a mana regeneration talent, or Schism. On the side of the class tree, these are the talents I run. There's a good argument to be made for running Sanguine Teachings and San Lane over Body and Soul and Void Shield, but both options are fine. Also, I have seen players opt to enhance the potency of their Desperate Prayer via Light's Inspiration, giving up the cooldown reduction provided by Improved Fade. However, I think it's only a good thing to do in very high key environments and when you need the added maximum HP. Finally, feel free to drop Mind Control and Mass Dispel depending on the dungeon, because they are not required in all dungeons. Let us now briefly discuss stats and trinkets. In terms of stats, aim for a good balance between crit and mastery. Crit is important because critical heals proc Divine Aegis, which is an additional absorb shield that can contribute up to 10% of your total healing in dungeons. Mastery, on the other hand, is a flat healing increase on targets with atonement. Add in some haste as well. I would recommend aiming for around 15 to 20% haste overall. In terms of trinkets, top priests mostly use m+guide jug as well as House of Cards. Generally, if your gear lacks crit, use the former. If your gear lacks mastery, use the latter. Sometimes Mr. Pick-me-up is used as well. However, for us mere mortals, these trinkets can be difficult to obtain on the Mythic track, which makes trinkets such as carved Blaziken wax more appealing. Signet of the Priory and Burin of the Candle King are also okay. Before we conclude, I want to leave you with a few general gameplay tips. First, if you're not already doing that, you might strongly want to consider looking into mouse over healing as a discipline priest, because you otherwise have to constantly switch between targeting enemies and targeting allies, which has much potential for mistakes. If you mouse over heal your teammates, you can just leave an enemy targeted for the entire fight and just spam out your damage rotation while healing your teammates with mouse over heals. Second, get a unit frames add-on or weak aura that allows you to see absorbs on unit frames even if the target is at full HP. I personally use the add-on Overshields combined with the standard Blizzard raid frames. Finally, get a weak aura or add-on that shows who is targeted by enemy spells. Especially Priest can make very strong use of that by pre-shielding or applying pain suppression to targets who are about to take damage. I use a weak aura called Targeted Spells to achieve that. Okay, that does it. If you liked the video, like it, and please also consider subscribing to my channel if you found it helpful. Also, if you want to see more Oracle Priest gameplay with live commentary, similar to the rotation segment, check out my Oracle Priest playlist next. Thanks for watching everybody, and see ya.